Hey everyone, I'm Diana Mills-Smith and I am a director and writer. So today I'm going to be talking about doing spectacle in budget. So what I mean by that is about having an ambitious idea for a film project, but making sure that you know not only that you can pull it off, but also that you're not going to run into problems later down the line in production where you realize that you've got to completely shift gears. So I think the best way to break it down is in the pre-production, production, and post-production stage. So pre-production is the most important part of ambitious filmmaking, because the more prep that you do, obviously that's going to pay off, but it's really important to know as much as you possibly can in terms of the scale and the scope of the idea that you have, because yeah, it's just crucial. So I think the first thing obviously starts with the script and making sure that when you're writing the script, you're probably keeping it in a relatively safe range. You know, maybe with your first kind of vomit draft, you can be as ambitious as you want, but you really need to think about reining it in so that you can kind of crack the loose edges into, you know, what the core of the story is. And once you kind of have that more refined version of the story, then you can think about, okay, what are the challenges that are going to come up in this project? So usually the biggest thing that is associated with spectacle is maybe action or VFX. So with action, you may be thinking about doing stunt work. Maybe you're thinking about doing some kind of special practical effects or pyrotechnics, those kind of things. And then the other side of that is obviously the visual effects, which is even more dangerous because that's going to be a lot more post-heavy in terms of what your ambitions are for the project. So let's first talk about the kind of action practical stuff. So this is the stuff that happens that you're going to want to pull off in production itself. So I think that the smartest move is to immediately begin thinking or scheduling blocking rehearsals or rehearsals. It could be kind of these dress rehearsals, or it could be contained stunt rehearsals. Like whatever it is, I think kind of schedule that into your production timeline, because it's going to be invaluable. What I usually like doing with stunt work, for example, is to do at least definitely one, but at least 2 to 3 stunt rehearsals, one of which you can be there or not be there as a director, and just let the stunt performers kind of find their footing in terms of executing what the scene is. Then the second time that you would have the rehearsal, you can be there and you can kind of observe and you can give notes and those kind of things. And then the third, that's where you can actually start bringing in the rest of your crew. So bringing in not only the cameraman to come in and think about exactly how you're going to block the shots, but also lighting department and even production design, because as soon as the stunt work is kind of mapped out, it's going to immediately begin creating limitations for what you can pull off on set. So for stunt work, I think trusting the team is something that's very, very important. The most important thing is probably getting a competent choreographer or action designer to realistically plan out what can be done in the time that you have. So if you've got a 10-page script and you're scheduling for 3 days, you can safely bet that 2 of those days are going to be just doing the action scenes. And so that's going to really chew into your setup and story and everything else that you're wanting to do with the script. So if you're wanting to make a film more narrative based and have stunts as part of like the spectacle in it, then you really need to think about the ratio of what you're willing to invest in terms of executing things on the shoot. When it comes to ambitions like the pyrotechnics or practical effects and things like that, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. Obviously, it can be very expensive to do those kind of things, but it's honestly worth it. My experience is usually I'll set aside like a budget or a timeline to pull off like a special effects makeup or something like that in the actual shoot day. But I'll be nervous about committing budget to makeup tests and things like that because it can get quite expensive. And I've honestly learned how big of a mistake it is not to do those tests. So really like committing to doing those things beforehand is absolutely crucial. When it comes to special effects, so this is again something that's going to be very heavy in the post-production process, and it's usually going to take a long time to craft and get right and all of that. And so the importance of doing as much in pre-production as possible in terms of like setting up exactly what you want to do. So let's say that you're doing something that is going to require matte paintings and 3D imagery like on your set so that you can, otherwise you're not really going to be able to establish the world of the scene that you're shooting. The best thing to do is to find the best thing that I would say to do is to find a location that is close enough to where you're actually going to shoot, and then think about like, okay, what is this location not giving you? So, for example, if you're wanting to do something, you're wanting to make a location feel like a lot larger or grander than it is, and you only have the budget or the resources to be able to do a smaller portion of that, like capitalize on what you are able to shoot and think about like, okay, the VFX are going to be for set extensions rather than building everything from scratch. I would say think about, specifically what it is that you're trying to achieve with the spectacle and the VFX. So if you're wanting to make the world feel bigger and grander, you don't necessarily need to have every single shot feel like this massive sweeping where you've got like it's a drone shot and it's a wide angle and you've got smoke and explosions and things like that in the background. You can usually sell setting in a few shots, one or two. And so it's sometimes good to think about or to approach a VFX team and say, look, we're not trying to do too much here. Like there's very specific, maybe one or two shots where we actually want to do something that's like ambitious and grand, and the rest of it is quite simple. Could be 2D VFX or something like that. But maybe there'll be one shot that takes 3D mapping and 3D, like a full 3D space. Then they can prioritize on that, and so that it's not too grand to pull off. The other thing is to think about approaching a VFX supervisor that could be on set with you. That's crucial, and just someone who understands how to actually execute these ideas and will be able to tell you what is going to work and what's not going to work. Obviously, you can do your own research and do as much of it as possible before getting on set, but it really makes a huge difference. And again, just like having these conversations as early as possible. So when it comes to production, so now that you're actually filming things, and let's say that things are going well, but you realize that some of the things that you were planning on doing are not actually going to be able to executable. So I think in that case, you've done the thinking, you've done the prep. So you've probably already thought about maybe alternatives of how you would do things if you need to adapt. But I would say that like knowing when to walk away from a shot that is just, you're not gonna pull off, it's really important. The reason why it's important is because spectacle is something that audiences are familiar with. They know more or less what the standard of well executed ambition is in movies. Like we see that in especially in like international Hollywood-esque films. But we're seeing it more and more in independent film as well, just because the tools are becoming more and more accessible to us. So the reason why I say that is, if you don't pull off the effect, I think it's detrimental to the tone and the scope of the project that you're going for, and it just becomes like really important that you get things right. If you've got 3 shots that are like really, really impressive, and then the 4th shot is just like, it does not sell, I think that makes a really lasting impression on audiences, unfortunately. And it can be difficult then to kind of get back that viewer confidence. So knowing when to walk away from a shot or a technique, I think, is really important. There are a lot of times easy ways out, so for example, if we're planning to do a shot where you wanted to do, if you're doing an establishing shot, for example, and you know that the VFX isn't going to be, that the plate isn't actually going to work, like thinking about the shot design and changing things on set, it's okay to do those things if you've done the necessary prep. So for example, if you've storyboarded out a scene and you've done, and you realize that 1 or 2 shots aren't going to work, because you've already done the work for those other shots, you can think about what's missing, and not being too rigid with things. I think is also important. A lot of times what happens especially in the stunt world, is you'll have a stunt sequence that's blocked out for maybe a 3-minute sequence, and you're filming and you get halfway through the shoot on that day and you realize that you've only done a 1/4 of what you were planning to in that day. And you'll need to think about like, okay, we're not gonna be able to achieve everything in this shot. So rather than trying to think about like, okay, how do I get people back? How do we, reschedule and do another shoot day? What I like to do is shoot bookend of the action sequences. So maybe if there's a few beats, or if there's an action beat that you shoot at the beginning, and then there's an action beat that you have at the end, think about, okay, is there a way that we can shoot something in the middle that will get us to the final action beat quicker? So I've been on sets before where we'll literally do that. We'll shoot the first sequence of the action, and then we'll shoot the last sequence of the action, and then because we know that we have 3 sequences that are going in between that, we'll basically go 2 and then 3, realize that we're not getting to 4, and then we'll adjust 3 so that it can quickly go into the 5th, which is the last sequence. So that's sometimes like good to keep in mind, because you don't want to get into the edit and not actually have a full action scene. So when it comes to post, I think the most important thing is to trust the work that you've done. So you've done the prep and you've shot everything and it seems like it's going really well. But now that you're in post, what are some of the problems that you're going to run into? Sometimes things just don't work. It doesn't, you plan out everything that you possibly could. You've prepped as much as you possibly can, and you've shot it as well as you possibly could, but you realize that it's actually going to take more time, more resources. The VFX are much more complicated than you originally expected. And I think that's where it can get really messy, because and I would argue that this is where what happens a lot in just the industry in general. Like the expectations of VFX, especially in post-production, is just to get it done, and that puts a lot of pressure on the post-production companies, and it can not only be really bad for the film itself, but it can also get into a thing where now you're asking more than you committed to, and that's just never really, like it's just, you want to avoid that. So thinking about like, okay, we approached this VFX company and we said that they would do 10 VFX shots. They realized that one VFX shot is the equivalent of 4 VFX shots, like respecting that and understanding that, okay, now one shot for whatever reason is going to take a lot more time. Think about what you can do to simplify the shots that can be simplified. For example, if you are realizing that one shot is extremely ambitious, let's say it's actually going to be a 3D approach rather than something that you thought was 2D. Think about if there's a way to do that shot in a 2D approach. So like, okay, we don't want to have something as extreme as what we were doing, but what can we do that will get across the same information? And maybe it's not going to be as grand and it's not going to be as ambitious as originally thought, but it is salvageable. Like be open to that, and listen to the VFX artists when they say that they might have ideas about how to do things simpler. That really can be something that can save a project. When it comes to action work in post-production, that's usually more on the edit side of things, and usually these shots will be very well planned out, because if you've worked with a choreographer and you've worked with a competent team, a lot of this was thought out and a lot of it was planned. But you'll find things in the edit that aren't quite melding together. Maybe a shot, it doesn't sell, or a punch doesn't sell, or a kick, or whatever. Maybe you have to think about clever ways of splicing 2 different action segments together that weren't initially supposed to go together. Those kind of things can be achieved in the edit. And maybe it can be a matter of killing your darlings, where you have to sacrifice some of the more ambitious scenes that you did, just to make sure that the story works. Another way that you can approach, I'm going to say, re-editing an action sequence. Sometimes it just won't have the same kind of oomph, or won't have the same kind of ferocity that maybe some of the rehearsals had. And this tends to be the case because when you're in a warehouse doing these stunt rehearsals, and it's just the stunt performers and a few mats and a competent camera person that's capturing all of this, things can go really well because there's not a lot of things that can come up. Whereas on the shoot, you'll have a lot more factors come into play, and maybe things are a little bit looser, messier. You can usually solve things in the edit. One of my most used effects to do in selling a punch, and obviously like it really takes a competent filmmaker, but it takes a competent stunt performer to sell the punch. But one way that you can sometimes help elevate that is by removing one frame anytime that there's an impact. So the simple way of describing it is that, like, if you've got 4 frames before moment of impact, so you have a character that's throwing a punch and they make contact, so you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 frames. What you can do is remove the 3rd frame so that you get 1, 2, 4, and it just creates this like quite intense. It doesn't feel jittery, but it does feel like a very like that moment of impact just feels harsher and harder. And so it's little things like that where you can actually help sell things. just in a way that feels more kinetic. When it comes to ambition and spectacle, like, I think it's, let me put it this way. People aren't going to care about an action sequence that's longer than 5 minutes. If you just give them a scene and it just starts and you've got two people that are ferociously going at each other, you get maybe about 5 minutes of audience interaction before I would argue that audiences just stop caring. And I think that it's just a reminder, like, if you want to do something that is really going to grip an audience, whether it's action or spectacle, like it really comes down to making the world or the character something that we care about. If you have audience engagement with, or audiences emotionally engaged with characters, and then they fight, you have something that's completely different, because now you're not just watching two skilled fighters. Now you're invested in the emotional stakes, which I think are a lot stronger than the physical stakes, at least when it comes to film. So I think that applies for spectacle as well. I think especially in the era that we are, where most of like these movies that are kind of getting let's say mass audience kind of appeal are usually like these high-end spectacle films. And that's for so long been reserved for $250 million films. Like, these just budgets that like are just unachievable. I think that the barrier to spectacle for independent filmmaking is really changing. It's really it's evolving, as things always do, and I think it's more accessible than ever to achieve these like ambitious ideas. So when pursuing those, like, don't forget like about the reason why those spectacles why spectacle. Let me say it this way. Think about spectacle as, I would say that spectacle is something that entices people, maybe early on. So like it's most useful in kind of the trailer or the pitch or selling people on the idea. And that spectacle, again, it's only really going to be engaging for an audience for a few minutes, unless you have characters and story that people care about. And so, again, it's a tool, and you don't want to get into a stage where you've got a great story and you want to go for something that is spectacular and ambitious, and then you're not able to pull it off. So it's just very important to make sure that it's pivotal to do the necessary pre-production and the work before diving in. I firmly believe that spectacle has a place in the independent scene. I think that there is a lot of push, focus, ambition in making cinema that is novel and things that haven't been done before. But like, we've collectively like grown up on these type of like Hollywood films and international films and films of this like massive scale. So we've been consuming that language, and I think it's really interesting when you take the language that you get from these let's call it tentpole films, and don't be scared to apply that to that kind of thinking to the short film or like passion projects, these kind of things, because you can do it. Like, it's incredible what can be achieved in independent filmmaking when you've got the right team and you've got a story that connects and engages with people. And so it really comes down to you know, it really comes down to the prep. Be bold, be ambitious. Like, I think those limitations of trying to keep your film small and contained, I think that there's wisdom in that, being safe. But I also think that it is so important that, like, when you're passionate and driven to do something that is, outside the box, like, go for it and, like, don't hold back.